My name is Cassie Nagel. I am the Education and Public Awareness Specialist with Children's Home Society, and I'm so excited to be here with you all today. Thank you very much for joining us for this session. Andrea gave a great introduction to the topics we'll be discussing, and I will let my co-host Tiffany introduce herself in just a second. But before we get started, I just want to kind of remind everyone that often when we start to talk about trauma and resiliency and things like that, we, especially those of us in helping fields and teachers, we often think that it's we're talking about those we serve or those that we help. And I just want to remind you that often it starts with ourselves. So we have to also be aware of our own trauma history, our own adversity history, our own resilience, and where we're at in that journey. So as we go through this information today, I just want to remind you to think not only about how this affects yourself, but also those students that you're working with. Also, I want to honor that while this information is not meant to be shocking or traumatic to hear, we're not going to tell a bunch of stories of, really awful things happening to kids. But I do want to honor that as we're talking about some of these topics, it can have an emotional effect on each of us. It can touch us in different ways. So I also want to just remind you to first and foremost be kind to yourself. Take some deep breaths where you're sitting. If you do feel yourself getting emotionally activated or triggered, feel free to step away if you need to. You certainly won't offend Tiffany or I if you do that. But please come back and join us when you can, and just put yourself first, put your own needs first here, and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Tiffany is going to start us off and talk about ACEs. So we're going to talk about some brain science, the ACEs study, and then we'll talk about the exciting stuff, the good stuff, the resiliency piece, and how we can build that both for ourselves, for those we serve, and really in the wider community. So thanks so much for joining us. As we go through, please do use your chat box if you have any questions. Tiffany and I will monitor that for each other while we're not presenting. So if it's a quick answer, we'll answer it in the chat box. If it needs some discussion, we'll just stop where we're at and respond to those questions. So do use that chat box if you have any feedback or questions or thoughts. We definitely want this to be as interactive as possible. So Tiffany, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Cassie. Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to be spending some time on your last day of this very awesome conference. I am Tiffany Petro. I'm the director of the Children's Home Child Advocacy Center. It's actually located in Rapid City. We have the Child Advocacy Center that serves the western side of South Dakota, as well as the statewide prevention initiative, which lets me do really cool things like come and speak with you and get to hang out with Cassie. So, I'm basically living my best life right now. Cassie did a great job talking about the topic, but again, please just interrupt us, but have a conversation. We're very conversational and we want to make sure that you get what you want out of this. So I don't know if you know, but ACE Interface has been in South Dakota since 2018 when Dr. Anda, who's one of the principal co-founders, came and trained 25 of us, and we geeked out a little bit, right? Here's the guy that wrote the study. But I don't know about you, but South Dakota sometimes is a little late to the game, right? We're a little late to pick up on stuff. And since 2018, through partnerships with the Center for Prevention of Child Maltreatment, Department of Education, Department of Social Services, we have trained over, 13,000 individuals in the topic of understanding trauma. For South Dakota, I'm pretty impressed with that number. And our family of trainers and presenters continues to grow every day, and just to be a part of such a movement. This isn't about educating, this is about creating conversation around a really tough topic, and to watch communities like Brookings, Rapid City, Sioux Falls really take this and run with it and really start to have these crucial conversations. Well, thanks for being part of that journey with us today. So when we talk about ACEs, it's about all of us. This is no longer an us versus them, those people with trauma. This is a we conversation, but we have to start at the very beginning, right? So we know that 85% of brain development happens in the first 3 years of life, that brains are born with all the brain cells that they're ever going to need. They're just not always hardwired together. But what we carry with us matters just as much as what the person that we're sitting across from is bringing into that situation. I imagine that if I asked you to tell me a song that reminds you of your first high school dance, you could think of something, or a smell that takes you back to grandma's or auntie's kitchen. We have those memories that are stored deep within us. We call them our issues in our tissues. And those memories that kind of live in us. And this is why people have anniversaries of loss, of grief. Think about your experiences like a little suitcase, right? And we carry around this little trauma suitcase, and it's just full of both positive and negative experiences. And when I pack my suitcase really well and I'm managing my self-care and I'm working on my resilience, I can take that little suitcase to every confrontation and every tough conversation and every moment, and it's going to be okay. But what we know about traumatic experiences, what we know about life in general, is that when I've just thrown everything into my suitcase, or I've been digging around and I've been digging up things that I forgot were buried in the bottom of that suitcase, when I meet that confrontation, when I meet that challenge, sometimes my suitcase explodes all over the sidewalk and all over the person that I'm talking to. Those are those issues in our tissues. We have to start by understanding that we're carrying that into every interaction we have with another human being. And that makes a difference on how we connect. So we'll go back to 7th grade science, right? Our bodies are meant to keep us alive and safe, right? I think about how many times have I driven home? I don't remember how I got there, right? I know I took every turn and I know I stopped at every stoplight, but I can't quite remember how I get there. Our bodies move through our universe, and is this hot coffee too hot to drink? Is it too cold? Is this chair going to support me? We understand this environmental safety. But the more we dig into how trauma impacts the way that we interact and see the world around us, we have to understand that our bodies are also keeping us safe from emotional interactions as well. Are you good for me? Do you have good intentions? I don't know if I should trust you. Our bodies are taking in messages all the time. And when individuals that grow up in chaotic or stressful environments have those repeated negative interactions or letdowns or broken promises, they will start to question relationships. And so those of us that need connection the most, that need interaction the most, will often have the hardest time creating connection and accepting help. Now, as helpers, as I'm sure we all are, that can get frustrating, right? But I'm good, I have good intentions, I want to help people. Understanding that sometimes it's not about us, it's about them being able to trust whether or not they can actually interact with us. So I said that, all those brain cells are in our little baby brains, but what do babies need to do? Eat, breathe, sleep, go to the bathroom. We have those basic fundamentals, but everything else needs to be hardwired together. And from the very first spark of life, we create little pathways or those synaptic neuron pathways in our brains. Children are egocentric, which means that their world revolves around them. That means that they're going to thrive in the environment at which they live. So if babies cry and mom doesn't come, they don't know that she's struggling with, say, postpartum depression. They're going to assume that they're not loved or being taken care of. Or children who act out because that's the only time that they get interaction, they will continue to act out, right? We are hardwired for connection, and so we will start to thrive in the environment so that we can survive in that environment. And so by the time that kids hit elementary age, brains are like fireworks, right? All of these synaptic neurons are firing and they're creating these little pathways in our brain. And that's great when we have a safe and stable home environment in which to safely explore, right? We're supposed to be learning about languages and science and STEM activities, but instead, so many of our youth are trying to figure out, all right, it's Friday, where does my next meal come from? All right, it's Tuesday night, how do I keep mom and dad safe? How do I keep the cops from coming? And so they start this process of hardwiring survival tactics, right? And so by the time that kids hit puberty, now for the purpose of this study, puberty was looked at the age of 14. All of this research came from Dr. Teicher at Harvard University. And they start a pruning process, or a use it or lose it, essentially, which means if I learn that a kick in the shin keeps me safe, it doesn't matter in which environment I'm in. A kick in the shin is what gets me through the day, right? So when we're talking to teachers, when we're talking to therapists and educators, it can get frustrating because you're taking this kid from this unsafe home or this unsafe environment in which they are activated or triggered, and you're putting them in a safe classroom. But their brains don't know that difference, right? They know that they are hardwired a certain way. They know that they have to survive, and their brains are now keyed and trained to always be waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now, I wish that this slide had one more graph on it, and I wish that it had an adult synaptic neuron pathway. Because I don't know about you, but I did not magically know everything when I turned 18. I still don't know everything. Don't tell my boss. This idea that we don't magically get these synaptic neurons hardwired when we turn 18. So society will tell adults, well, you don't get to have a bad day. You're an adult now, kind of, get over it, get through it. Understanding that those things still have to be taught. Now, the bright side of this is that research will look at something called neuroplasticity, which means that our brains are plastic and they can learn. Up until the age of 70, we have at least some neuroplasticity. And that means that we can still learn those new things, but it does take longer the older we get to learn those coping skills. So asking ourselves, is this a question of can't or won't? Is this something that they're willfully just not wanting to do? Or is this something that maybe they don't have the skill set necessary to follow through with? Now, we always want to hold space for the fact that we are not cultural or historical experts. There are certainly people in our state and our communities that hold that information and are respected for doing so. When we talk about historical or intergenerational trauma, we're honoring the fact that the science has proven that you actually can pass both adversity and resilience into the next generation. And so epigenetics, right? This is the 10,000-foot view of this, guy. So if this interests you, please dive deeper. Epigenetics answers the age-old question, is it nature or nurture? It's both, right? You can have genetic predispositions, but in a safe and protective environment can counteract that. And you can have healthy or less adversity pass through your DNA coding, but if you're in a toxic or stressful environment, that can impact you. So when we think about how DNA is impacted, those histones attach to your DNA and cause it to be open and read in a different way, or to not be opened at all. It can act like a light switch, because what they're finding is that epigenetic science can show how some people might have heart or health or other issues later on into their adulthood years because of some adversity that they faced. One study they looked at was rats and cherry blossoms. And so they took these male rats and they conditioned them to have a fear response to the smell of cherry blossoms. Those rats were then bred, and those pups were removed from their parents and not introduced to any sort of fear response. And they were brought back into the lab, the pups, at a certain level of maturity, and they were given just the smell of cherry blossoms. And what do you think happened? heart rate increased, pupils dilated. They had a fear response. Now, women, we know that we have all the eggs that we're ever going to have. And so when my grandma is pregnant with my mother, I'm in there somewhere. So the adversities in the environment that my grandma was facing impacted me on a cellular level. And when my mom was pregnant with me, my daughter was in there. And so understanding that although we cannot erase, we cannot undo the hardships and the adversities and the atrocities of our history, like we can't undo things like boarding schools or the Holocaust. What we can do is create moments of protective factors, put in protective factors in place to help counteract the passing of those adversities from one generation to the other, hopefully lessening it as we get further away from that adversity. We want to talk a little bit about the specific parts of the brain that get impacted by trauma. Now, the limbic system is one of those, is that kind of, I think of it kind of like the second floor of the house, right? So when I think about how the brain develops, I like to talk about it like it's a house, right? So the foundation or the first part of your brain to develop is the reptilian brain. It's that survival brain, whichever word you choose. And that's that part of brain that is often looking for safety, for emotional, psychological, physical, your needs to be met. And when those needs go unmet, right, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, your foundation is shaky. So this next part of your brain that gets developed, that next floor up, is the limbic system. That is where your amygdala and your hippocampus, right? So your amygdala, which is responsible for your fight, flight, or freeze, and your hippocampus, which is responsible for your memories, that's where that lives. But when we look about how much is regulated in this portion of the brain, when we think about the adversities or the challenges or the things that we would like to see changed in our community, how much of that can be attributed to dysregulation of emotions? If individuals had better coping skills, if we were teaching from birth how to deep breathe and be mindful, how much better off would our communities be because of the ability to regulate? Not only that, but looking at how children learn, how they remember the classroom day from day to day. So we talked about the amygdala and the hippocampus. Those are right in there, and they're partners, right? These are vital for relationships because they, memories can cue up a fear response, and a fear response can cue up a memory. And that can make it very difficult because what happens is this amygdala part of your brain can get hyperactive, right? It can get so much blood flow when you're growing up in a toxic stress environment that it's always on the lookout for danger. This can make it hard for kids to remember rules, remember to read social cues, stunting their emotional connection to others, which then, of course, makes it harder as adults to make relationships, make connections and collaborations. The vermis is that bottom part of the brain that is often referred to as the seat of mental health. It really connects the two halves of the cerebellum. It helps us move through our physical environment by but also taking into account what's going on around us. So again, this part of the brain can be impacted because of reduced activity or hyperactivity in this area. And because it's so closely correlated with mental health, when it goes well and this part of your brain is positively developed, we have good self-awareness, good perception, good ability to pay attention. But what we see happen so often is that those poor mental health or diminished mental health capabilities can lead to more self-coping, more issues of ADHD, problems in the classroom, which then make more risk for substance, drug, and alcohol reliance. So there are certain points in the brain where how things develop. And the corpus callosum is one of those parts of the brain that can be impacted differently depending on your gender and your age and the type of trauma. So for boys who were neglected in the first 3 years of life, the right side of your brain can have a hard time speaking to the left side of your brain. But for girls who were sexually abused between the ages of 7 and 9, they have a hard time with their right side of the brain speaking to the left side of their brain. So when we think about how important it is for our brain hemispheres to be communicating, right? As we move through life, I always laugh because I went into social work so I wouldn't have to do math. And I always think back to algebra class where it's like, okay, you've got 52 square watermelons and you have to get on a train going backwards to Poughkeepsie. How long does it take you? And my brain's like, I have so many questions. Why are the watermelons square? Why do I have to go backwards? Where's Poughkeepsie, right? Lots of questions about this. But understanding that when we think about how adults may, even ourselves, may have a hard time interacting or assimilating to the world around us, perhaps it's not because they're being defiant or willful, but maybe their brain just works in a different way. We essentially have these two different worlds that people have the possibility of experiencing. The first would be this bottom benevolent world where kids are safe and they learn that they have power and they can trust people and they move through life a little bit easier. Now, as a parent of 2 teenagers, I fail every day. I do not get it right. But something I take solace in is that I don't always fix things for my kids, right? They have to sometimes just fall safely, flat on their face. And understanding that this isn't about creating a world that's free of stress and trauma, because although we can prevent specific traumas, we can't 100% make everything completely safe. And science has shown that there's a difference between stresses. What we're trying to avoid is toxic stress. Toxic stress is where we don't have hope, where we don't have connections, where we don't feel like we have solutions to solve. Moments of tolerable or manageable stress actually have shown to increase our ability to be resilient and overcome and actually build up our self-efficacy. Unfortunately, we have too many individuals that have grown up in this top world, which is the malevolent world, where they are met with danger, toxic stress, chronic issues of systemic injustice, poverty, or intergenerational issues. And the fight, flight, or freeze, which is pretty well conditioned by the time we're in our early 20s, can actually get dysregulated. Now, this is important to understand because our brain doesn't fully develop until we're 25. Even after that point, even as I'm well aware, like well away from 25, when I'm not managing my vicarious trauma or my compassion fatigue, my fight, flight, or freeze can get dysregulated too. And so think of it like a window of tolerance. And so when we're not managing our stress, when we're getting too much toxic stress or chaotic moments, our window of tolerance gets lower, right? Certainly you can probably think of a time where you or somebody that you love or care about was dysregulated in this way. They were quick to anger or despondent and apathetic. Too much of that, and our window just stays limited. And it makes interacting with the world, keeping jobs, passing classes, making friends, it can make all of that more difficult because people don't want to interact with us, right? Now, society will tell you that individuals who move through the world in a different way, that have a different way of coping, are broken, are unsavable, are bad. I have never met somebody who's struggling with substance abuse issues that argued that it was good for them. They knew that. What I often forgot to give them credit for is that they were surviving in a world that I knew nothing about. what if we start to shift the conversation from what's wrong with you? Why do you keep doing that? To what happened to you? Tell me your story. I want to sit with you. We have to stop deciding. So let me back up. I work at a child advocacy center. We talk to kids all day, every day about some pretty horrific things that have happened to them. And one of the things that I'm passionate about is letting survivors survive in a way that makes sense for them. We'll figure it out on the other side. We'll talk about healthy coping. We'll talk about building better school or better toolboxes. But the reality is if you got up today and you showed up at work and you're surviving, or you lived through a traumatic episode in any way possible, then you did exactly what your body was designed to do. Good job, right? And changing this conversation about how people survive. And holding ourselves accountable when we set expectations on how someone else should adapt to their story, to their experiences, we've already set them up to fail. Understanding that when we're truly ready to meet that child or that individual or that loved one right where they are, it means being vulnerable enough with ourselves to come without expectations on what they should have, could have, would have done, because shame is not what is motivating change. Empathy is what's motivating change. So trauma is as individual as your thumbprint, right? So look at your thumb. There are no two thumbprints that are the same, but what that means is that how I view the experience, we get this question a lot, is you can have a sibling set that have experienced similar sets of trauma, but how I viewed it and how I overcame it may be very different than a sibling. But what the research shows us is that the type of maltreatment and the gender, so biological gender of that individual and the age at which they experience it, shows some consistencies on how it impacts the brain development. Thinking about all of those seedlings that we that we are all born with, right? So that means babies have the capability, have the seedlings to do math. They just don't need that. And our brains are only meant to handle toxic stress for 20 minutes at a time. Anything over that, and we're getting too many of those stress responses. And so think about it like you have these seedlings in a garden, and this toxic experience sneaks into your garden at night and sprays Roundup all over your seedlings, killing off some of them, damaging other connections, weakening some of them. Now, you might get your garden to a safe place. You might build a fence and keep out whatever is damaging it. And everything seems fine. It bounces back. But then months later, when you go to reap a harvest, your plants didn't produce. So you have kids entering into the foster care system or being adopted, for example, at a very young age. And when they come back as teenagers, later on, as they're getting older as teenagers, they go back to the shelf and the book is not there, right? Something they needed, that connection, which means that we might not see the impact of trauma for a long time. Reminding us to stay present about who the person is in front of us. And understanding that even into early adulthood, that these impacts can be dysregulating, right? So we have until 25 before our brain is fully developed. Think about the things that happen before we're 25. We send people to war. Well, we did just raise the smoking age, right? But drinking, self-coping. So all of these experiences are still impacting our brain development, even early, or even into early adulthood, So collectively, we really have a choice. We've talked about all these sensitive developmental periods, how it impacts the brain in those formative years. But what do we do with it? What does this mean for where we sit now in our communities, in our agencies, and looking forward? Before I dive into the ACE study, Cassie and I are always mindful about how heavy that brain section is. We both love it, but it's a lot of information. And so because we're blessed with having additional time this morning, thank you, I want to open it up. Do you have questions or thoughts about what we've talked about so far? And you can just put them into the chat box if that works for you, and feel free to share what you're comfortable sharing. Yeah, Stacy, I'm glad that you had some introduction too. Yes, a lot. I just uploaded a bunch of handouts to our session 7. It's all under session 7, including our PowerPoint, so you can go back and review it. You bet. Please continue to use the chat box and enter in any questions while we move forward. So I'd be interested to know how many of you know your ACE score. If you, I'm not asking you to share your ACE score. I'm just wondering how many of you might do it. So if it's yes or no. Thanks, KR. Just a yes or no if you've ever taken your ACE score. All right. I love the no's just as much as I love the yeses. Is that weird, Cassie? Okay. So some caveats about, thank you for sharing that, guys, and being vulnerable with us in those moments. So what we want to share about the ACE study is that it is not a predictive tool, right? The ACE study and the ACE questionnaire doesn't tell me how awesome you are, what your strengths are. And it's really meant, it was really designed to be a reflective tool about how we got to where we are and the risks that might be in front of us. So understanding that as we're moving into this next section, you might be having some internal reflection, and I encourage that, but please know that you can reach out to Cassie or I privately, or process anything that you need to. We want to make sure that you feel safe and supported as we're going into this section. So the ACEs study is not new by any means, right? 95 and 97 is when this study was conducted. And it's really fascinating about how it came about. So on 2 separate sides of the country, right, Dr. Anda, who was working with the CDC, was doing a research study on how depressed people were more likely to smoke, okay? In California, Dr. Vincent Felitti had a weight loss clinic. Now, his weight loss clinic was having a lot of success, except he had this one client named Patty. And Patty was doing really well, and then she started putting on weight again, and then she was kind of like wanting to drop out of the study. And so Dr. Felitti brought her in, and as a woman, I certainly know that these are questions that get asked, but he asked her how old she was when she first had intercourse, and she said 9. I was 9 when my grandpa started sexually abusing me. And he went back to look at other individuals who had dropped out of his study and found that there was like 253 of them that shared a common history of childhood sexual abuse. There's something interesting that happens specifically with childhood sexual abuse, which is often, not always, but often when individuals will start to lose the weight, they will gain the attention of the opposite gender, and will start to feel triggered or concerned about safety, and then will put the weight back on as a way to protect themselves. Dr. Anda and Vincent Felitti got connected through a mutual friend and said, hey, I think we're working on similar paths here. And they got together and created one of the largest epidemiology studies of its time. What is important to note here is that they did not cherry pick a community. They did not pick an indigenous community. They didn't go to inner city Chicago. They didn't go to one of the boroughs in New York City. They worked with San Diego, California, with the World Health Maintenance Organization, so preventative health care. These were 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. The sample size was over 17,000, which if you like research and you read research, you just don't get those sample sizes. And what they found was really astonishing. Now, before ACEs, right, we knew that if you were taking health risks, so if you were using IV drug use, if you were drinking while driving, if you had a lot of unprotected sexual encounters, that you were going to be more at risk for disease, disability, and early death. Okay, we knew that. ACEs came along and said, whoa, trauma actually changes the way your brain works, and you're going to have more difficulties with social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, which will make you more at risk for those health behaviors leading to disease, disability, and early death. The original ACE study did not even consider or take into consideration historical trauma or intergenerational adversity. That science of epigenetics came much later. That told us that kids were actually being born with trauma, depending on the family that they were born into, just because of how trauma and adversity can be passed. And then all of those things remained true. But here's what they weren't counting on. You can take the health risks and behaviors out. If you experience trauma while your brain is developing, you will see the world and interact with it in a different way. But you can be what I refer to as a kale eating, marathon running, law abiding, red-blooded American, and still be at risk for disease, disability, and early death. So much so that they found that when you have an ACE score of 6 or more, that your life expectancy drops by 20 years. Stick with me, this slide gets a little heavy. This is the equivalent of me saying, as a professional in this work, taking my kids to the Black Hills Residential Facility here in Rapid City, where we serve children ages 3 years to 12 years, and saying, I know how to help them, but I'm not going to, because your life is more important. Your ACE score is more important. It felt socially irresponsible to have this information and not do something with it. But I want to go back to your ACE score is not a death sentence. It tells me a snapshot of your history, but it doesn't tell me about all the resilience factors that got passed down to you, or all of your coping skills, or how great you are at Zumba or cross stitch. It doesn't tell me any of that. But what we do know is what is predictable is preventable. Dr. Anda shared when he was training us that he's really a preventionist at heart. His whole mission for creating this was to lessen the amount of trauma being passed to future generations, right? We can't go back, but we can look forward. And when he got this information, he said he took it to his bosses at the CDC, the same CDC that we're listening to now, and he said, we figured it out. We know how to prevent trauma. We know what to do and how to help. And they said, great. Can you write a prescription for it? No, trauma doesn't work like that. Great. How about can you build a binder that we can put a protocol in place in every city across the nation? As Cassie will tell you, that's not how resilience works. That's not how healthy healing communities process. We need to find advocates. We need to be champions, right? We need to move this forward. And they said, we're not interested. And they shelved it for decades. And it wasn't until Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, she has a TED Talk, it's on a list of resources for you to check out later if you haven't. She made it popular again because she was able to connect it to her pediatric clinic in California. understanding, and one of the lines that she says from that movie that I love so much is when she was learning about public health and getting her medical degree, that you could write prescription after prescription for medication for diarrhea, or you can walk to the well and say, what is wrong with this well? And ACEs allows us to have a conversation about what's going on in this community. So these were the original 10 questions. I'm going to walk through them, and I encourage you, if you feel comfortable, you can make a little tally for your ACE score for yourself. Again, you don't have to. I'm not going to ask you to share it, but I do want to say, if your trauma, if your experience isn't on this chart, it's not that it didn't matter. They picked the 10 most things in the 90s that they felt impacted child development, child engagement. Also, it wasn't about how many times you experienced this event. It was about how many different types of trauma in general you experienced. So you can have a 0 all the way to a 10. Now, the qualifiers for the ACEs questionnaire is that before the age of 18, that a parent or guardian struggle with substance abuse, which would be alcohol or drugs. Understanding that if it was a yes for you, it would be a 1. Were your parents divorced? Did someone in your household struggle, a parent or guardian struggle with mental illness? Did you witness domestic violence against your mother or stepmother? Now, we would never call it battered mothers today. And one of the limitations for the ACEs questionnaire is that it only looked at mothers and stepmothers. We, of course, know that fathers and males can be victims as well. But did a parent or guardian go to prison? Did you often feel like no one had your back? You didn't have someone to support you? You didn't have clean clothes to eat? Did someone not take you to the doctor? Did you not have your physical needs met? Did you experience emotional, physical, or sexual abuse? There's a lot of limitations. There's a lot of experiences that aren't covered. It doesn't cover abuse by siblings or other children in the home. It doesn't cover other trusted adults. And we know that 90% of the time for sexual abuse, that abuser is known to the child. But you might have yourself an ACE score, -3, and it doesn't matter which 3, because it's less about what I've experienced, but understanding how that plays a role in who I've become. We know that 87% of the time, if you have 1, you're more likely to have 2. Now, in the state of South Dakota, we have started to collect some data, and I want to share that with you. In basic foster care for the Department of Social Services, children coming into foster care average about a 3 or 4 ACE score. We know this because their ACE score is taken at the point that they come into care by their caseworker. Children in residential facilities such as Wellfully, Black Hills Children's Home, Our Home, Sioux Falls Children's Home, they average about a 6 to 7 ACE score by the time they hit residential care, understanding that those kids have often experienced more hardships in their young life. The Burfus study did a survey, I think in 2017, and so for the individuals who had a cell phone or who had a phone, who answered the phone and who took the survey, what we know of that small population is that 23% of those individuals said, yes, I have at least one of these ACEs. These were the numbers for the overall 17,000 individuals. Where would you put your community? I would put Rapid City probably on an average of, most people have about 3 to 4 ACEs on average. Now, if I was speaking about one of our tribal communities that we work with, it might be higher. Where would you put your community at? I would love to see you just pop into the chat box and just give me a number on where you think your business would be at, or your community, just a number about where you think your community would be reflective on this for South Dakota. 3 or 4, yeah. Yeah. Lots of 3 to 4s. Good's good. Thank you. So, although what is predictable is preventable, we know that the risk increases. We think about this like gas in the car. The more ACEs you have, the more risk is there. So when we talk about when I finally stop talking and Cassie gets to share, she'll talk about resilience factors. I want you to think about them like speed bumps, right? So you've got a full tank of gas because you have an ACE score of 3 and you're going the road like this. Resilience is like, oh, we're gonna slow down here, right? We're gonna find a different way to cope and interact. I want to go through some of the statistics with you that we got from the study. I didn't do it, they got from the study, just to show you how this might be representative in your community or those that you work with. So, witnessing domestic violence. As we know more about children being in an environment which is experiencing domestic violence, we know that the risk of them personally experiencing emotional, physical, or sexual abuse increases. So the more often that they see it, the more at risk that becomes. One of those dynamics that we like to, be mindful of when talking about domestic violence is that is often about control. It's often about having something over that other person. Understanding that the more that violence increases, the more control they're seeking, right? So what do we understand about addiction? Is that baseline wears off and we have to do more to get that same level of high, right? This is why people elevate in their substance use, their addiction to their cell phones, their caffeine. I'm not without fault here, guys, but understanding that these are how these things can easily increase. Now, again, you've heard me talk about, there wasn't a client I've worked with in my career that I had to tell them that meth wasn't healthy for them. They knew that. And one of these kind of argument points that people want to say is, well, why do they do it if it's bad for them? So let's take smoking, for example, right? Even if you are a smoker, I would imagine that nobody here would say, oh, smoking's super healthy for me, right? When we looked at this particular study, they looked at the age of 12 as early smoking initiation. Well, why do 12-year-olds smoke? To be popular, because their parents do, because their friends do. Even when we know, we've had every campaign across the nation, from it'll make your teeth yellow to it damages your lungs to you're going to die. And yet people continue to smoke. I know in Rapid City, a year or so back, we had a case of a 9-year-old elementary school having a vape at their elementary school. And I know that my children go to the nice side of town, on the west side of town, and they find vape cartridges all over the field. And so we know that those kids are vaping. When we think about something like mental health, and you saw that percentage was 17% said, yes, my parent or guardian struggled with mental illness in my home. That was the 90s. And we certainly talk more freely about mental health and mental well-being, but there's still a lot of shame for those that are experiencing it. Now, although nicotine is a stimulant, what happens is when you give a stimulant to somebody whose brain is going 100 miles an hour, it actually does the reverse and starts to slow it down. So individuals often are finding themselves dealing with anxiety, ADHD, PTSD, and it's easy to go get a pack of cigarettes, or it's easy to pick up a vape pen, because my other option is talking to someone and telling them my deepest, darkest secrets that I might not be ready to share. And so when we think about early smoking initiation, why kids might be turning to nicotine, right? You talked about the cerebellum vermis, right? And how that is the seat of mental health. And if it's hyperactivated, right, we're gonna have attention problems. I'm having a hard time paying attention. I'm not feeling so great. Let's slow the train down, right? even at the risk. Sometimes people choose unhealthy coping skills. When we talk about something like homelessness, if you have an ACE score of 68, you have a 29% chance of experiencing homelessness. Often the argument here might be, oh, that's just the life they chose, or if they could just get a job and they wouldn't be homeless anymore. Starting to understand how those puzzle pieces connect, right? So I experienced trauma, my social, emotional, and cognitive functioning changes that puts me more at risk of being excluded from society, from having attention issues, addiction issues, all of those things leading up to a hard time keeping a job, health issues that make it difficult to work, connected to I might experience homelessness. What happened to you? Tell me your story. Now, we talked about this difference between men and women, biological genders, understanding that women at a 4 or more are 60% more likely to experience depression, and men about 39%. There's a lot of factors that we could discern from this type of graph. Obviously, men's brains and women's brains do work a little bit differently, so we may be more in tune to our emotional health. But this is an example of how a societal context can impact how men may be reporting their mental health issues. Men aren't allowed to be sad, to even have a bad day. They get labeled as weak. Maybe they get labeled as angry. Men are not afforded the same labels or descriptors that women are. And there isn't a community that I know of that hasn't been touched by suicide, death by suicide, or suicide attempts. And the original ACE study does ask if someone attempted suicide, but it doesn't talk about death by suicide. But we know that at 4 or more, that risk goes up to almost 18%. I've had children that have come into our center that are as young as 9 that have had a plan to self-harm or to attempt to take or to die by suicide. We have children that come from our mental health, our regional west, that are coming here after a suicide attempt. This is becoming a very plausible option for those that are struggling to make sense of what's going around them. We have to start creating these conversations and being willing to enter into that uncomfortable place with them, so that they don't turn to this as an option. This is a slide that I love to show people when I get, oh, I don't have to worry about trauma. My kids don't have trauma. Well, do your kids go to public school? Do your kids exist in the time of COVID-19? Because everybody's experiencing trauma. I just saw an article this morning about how this is one of those environmental traumas that will have impacts on our children's brain development. When we stop and we say, all right, so if I had an ACE score of 4 or 5, I might have 3 or more of these health or social problems. There is nothing on this list that is easy to manage, that makes my life any easier. And maybe as you're reflecting, you've kind of got an idea about what your ACE score might be. And you might have some of these health and social problems. So here's our challenge as our community. This is why Cassie and I talk from parent to professional. We're not just talking about those that work with individuals that are experiencing trauma, but also those that have experienced the trauma, that are lived experience. If you have these moments, how much harder might it be to get to your appointments on time, to find a babysitter, to manage your workload, to fill out paperwork? In social services, we certainly have a lot of paperwork sometimes. Understanding that even the individual in front of us, we might not know their story that's going on behind their smile or their anger. So, what is your story? What is bringing you to the table? What are you bringing to the table with you? And how can you impact change right where you are? there isn't anything in our society that we would like to see change that can't be, let me pause. Most things can be connected back to trauma because trauma doesn't explain everything. There are people who will make unhealthy coping choices that have not experienced trauma. At least trauma that is known to us. It might be genetically transferred. But this is what we call an oil slick slide, because we're going to move into this moment of hope and peace and joy, and Cassie gets to take you and like lift you back up after I've made you all sad. Don't worry, we'll get you there. But you don't have to stop being passionate about what drives you, what motivates you. When we understand that 78% of all IV drug use can be attributed to high ACEs, 56% of anxiety, 61% of adult incarceration. When we start to understand the why behind this percentage, this number, and if we all do what we can, if we show up in a way that works, if we're meeting people where they're at, we can each reduce this oil slick by a little bit, right? So if I'm passionate about, say, depression, and I want to help people, and I get 41% down to 40%, 1% of that oil slick is a lot of people. And so although we may not be feeling like we are making a big impact, every drop in the bucket counts, right? And Cassie and I have often talked about putting more drops in the bucket than somebody can drain out the bottom, if that makes sense, right? So even if we're feeling like, oh, this isn't gonna matter, trust me, every drop in the bucket helps. And understanding that we know that ACEs are going to happen. They have happened and they will continue to happen. But we can do something about it. And that if we don't, we as a society are going to say that we're okay with health risk and behaviors, and we're okay with transmission of ACEs. But every step along this graph or this slide, we can put some protective factors in place and we can actually slow that transmission. All right, you get a break from me. We're gonna take just 2-second pause, and I just wanna offer up the chat box again for any questions on the ACEs study. Of course, you can ask them at any point, but as Cassie's taking us into resilience, what's your thoughts? Where are you at today?
Andrea, thank you for sharing that link to the resources again. Some of you in the chat have already shared that this is a lot of information. It absolutely is. It is not our goal to overwhelm you, but there is so much meat here to go through. And so I just really encourage you to look through those resources and find your own. That is not an exhaustive list of resources either. That's what we rely on. That's what we found to be interesting and helpful. But honestly, the science here, we are learning more and more about ACEs and the effect of adversity in childhood, as well as the effect of resilience and protective factors. We're learning so much day after day after day. There's just so much out there, which is why we are just so excited to be here and take every opportunity to introduce people to the science, because that's what this is, an introduction. We're not giving you all the answers today because we don't have them. Our hope is that, this is going to spark something for you that encourages you to really make this a part of your practice, to continue to stay updated on what's happening, and to make resiliency and resilience building and trauma-informed care a part of your classroom, a part of your school, a part of your community. So Tiffany, thank you for taking the heavy part. I appreciate it. I appreciate getting to take resilience because, man, I just love this stuff. It gets me so excited because, like Tiffany talked about, there is so much potential here, and what seems like a drop in the bucket does spread, right? It does make a difference even if you don't see it immediately. So recognizing that you may feel a little heaviness right now because some of those statistics were pretty sobering. But let's get into the good news, because knowing that sobering information is what leads people to figuring out what now. How do we change that? How do we interrupt this cycle? So when we talk about resilience, what does that mean to you? What do you think of when you hear the word resilience? And I would invite you to just think about that internally, to share in your chat box. What do you think about? What comes to mind when you hear the term resilience? Bouncing back, yep, moving forward with new experiences, absolutely. A rubber band, oh, that's a great visual. Overcoming, Yeah, those are great. And that's the thing, resilience means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but there is sort of this core of like the capacity for healthy development, successful learning in spite of challenges. So there's the two edges of that, right? Challenges and success within those challenges. So resilience is the capacity to spring back, to rebound, to successfully adapt in the face of adversity, and to develop social, academic, or vocational competence, despite being exposed to extreme stress or simply to the stress that is inherent in today's world. All of that is encompassed in resilience. Now, when we look at then building resilience, I want to start with giving kind of an overview of what is trauma-informed care. When we talk about resilience and building resilience into the way that you teach, the way that you really organize your school or your community, whatever group it is, it starts with these principles of trauma-informed care. And you heard Tiffany really talk about a lot of this within her whole part of this discussion. It's not only the principles, these principles that matter for the changes we seek, but they're important because we're working to assure people, especially kiddos who are most affected by that adversity, that they have a safe place here to learn. And so our hope is that these principles of trauma-informed systems of care can be embedded really in every aspect of society. That's the end goal. It's not just for youth serving organizations, not just for schools. This is just as important for the factory doing manufacturing. When we decide that we care about all people and recognize that some kids get through their childhood and they become adults and they've never had that introduction of protective factors. We can do that at any point in life. Certainly our brains are more malleable, and we can get in front of it if we catch it in childhood and start to introduce those factors. But even into adulthood, it's never too late to start to build resilience in people and to give them the benefit of trauma-informed care. So the guiding principles here for trauma-informed care we'll go through real quickly. And these may look different depending on the organization or the community that you're in, but safety is key. Safety is absolutely key. And this is not just physical safety. This is really that emotional safety, that psychological safety that says, I can show up here as my whole self. I don't have to present a mask. I don't have to pretend to be I don't have to pretend to have it all together when I show up here. I can be my whole self with all of my successes and assets and positive attributes, as well as what I'm struggling with and maybe not quite perfected yet. I can show up here and strive to practice and progress. I don't have to be perfect here. So that safety is absolutely key. We show the film Paper Tigers often, and one of the quotes out of that is, a stressed brain cannot learn. So we first have to start with, just like Tiffany mentioned, with that hierarchy of needs. We have to start with safety. If kids don't feel safe, they are in that lower level of the brain, which is not allowing them to move up to those higher levels that allow complex thought and memory even. So they may be hearing that lesson, but it's not being stored because they're in their very base brain. So we have to make sure that we're giving them safety first and foremost. And trustworthiness and transparency plays right into that. It's really hard to feel safe if you don't trust the people that you're with. So as a teacher, it's so important to build a sense of trustworthiness with your students, with your coworkers, with other faculty. We show up as our best selves when we trust the relationships around us. And that comes with, really holding space for everyone to contribute to solutions. And so that brings in that choice and collaboration, recognizing that adults and kiddos who are most affected by adversity often also have the most creativity and the most ingenuity when it comes to problem solving, because they've had to do it day in and day out. I had an interesting conversation with the Lincoln County Sheriff the other day as part of a community conversation on criminal justice. And he talked about how a lot of things don't work. The 24/7 program is good in theory, but the folks that are on 24/7, they figure out ways to get around that ankle bracelet, or they will do trial and error to figure out when they have to stop drinking in order to pass that breathalyzer at a certain point in the day. And you can see that as a barrier to solutions, or you can recognize the ingenuity that these folks are putting into their daily life. And if we can then tap into that ingenuity and give them a place to contribute in meaningful ways with that ingenuity, with that very problem-solving skills, then they will begin to feel a part of the solution if we let them collaborate. Even with kiddos, we see a difference when we give them choices. Certainly, they don't run the show. They can't choose absolutely anything, but if instead of just telling them what to do, we offer two options and we're okay with either option, they feel like they're a part of that solution building. So collaboration and choice work really well together. Peer support is huge. Being able to see that they are not the only one going through the things that they're going through. When they see that their experience is reflected in somebody else, that they can connect in that experience, and they're not alone in it. Again, that opens up for healing and for that resiliency, that moving forward despite the adversity. Empowerment, not only in choice, but just recognizing that their ideas are worthy of action. Respecting a student's ability to generate ideas, to act upon those. That's really being a trauma-informed teacher, being a trauma-informed educational environment. There are lots of ways, big and small, that you can do this. And then that last piece of cultural, historical, and gender issues. Like Tiffany, I don't pretend to be an expert in all of these things, but we can recognize that throughout history there have been biases in different gender issues. There have been biases in cultural issues, historical issues. So recognizing where we're at on those topics, recognizing where our own biases lie is really important. But then also, again, allowing space for that in the classroom to say that these students are all coming with different levels, different experiences based on gender, different experiences based on cultural norms, cultural history, their own familial history, let alone cultural history, but leaving space for that in the classroom, and being able to have conversation about it, recognizing that kids are bringing all that into the classroom, so we have to have space for it. We can't ignore those things. And again, recognizing where we are at nationally, in terms of race relations and the political environment. These are things that kids are dealing with, and we can't pretend that they don't exist just because we're in a classroom. They can't often just leave those things at the door. So recognizing how those histories play into that student's current experience is really important. When we look then at the resilience science, what comes out is that there are really three protective systems that interact and guide positive adaptation to adversity. And those systems are individual capabilities, attachment and belonging with caring and competent people, and protective community, faith, and cultural processes. As educators, you really have the capacity and the opportunity to affect each and every one of these three systems. And what do we know about individuals who do well despite adversity? We know that these three protective systems are nested. So people do best when they are living in thriving families, in thriving communities. And really, we can help one another and kiddos to develop those personal attributes that help us all weather life's storm. So when we talk about those individual protective factors, things like positive view, self-efficacy, self-regulation, positive view is really what lets me know I'm important and valuable. It helps me ask for help when I need it. It's really closely related to hope, and together they help me to not give up. Positive view is about the story that we tell ourselves that says good things happen to me. And as educators, when we notice the core gifts of each student, of each person, and help them to find opportunities to give those gifts to the community or to the classroom that they care about, we are automatically helping to generate that positive view and hope. We know that people with positive view, hope, and social emotional support, they are more likely to complete at least 1 year of post-high school education. They're less likely to be depressed, and they're more likely to be employed, even in a deep recession. All key things to successful life outcomes. Self-efficacy then is this belief that what I do influences what happens to me. Goes back to that choice and control and collaboration. And simple things help build self-efficacy. And most of you are probably well aware of this in the classroom. But we do it in our homes too, right? We ask kids as they get older to do tasks or chores, things that contribute to the classroom that have real value for our family or our classroom or our community. And then we encourage kiddos and adults alike to build skills that are more complex and take time to develop and are able then to contribute even more to that community or classroom. Self-regulation then is, I think, so exciting for me to talk about because we don't often talk about it. But I've seen some topics within the conference here that really talk about that self-care and things like that. And so it's exciting to see this conversation happening more and more. But self-regulation is our ability to gauge our state of mind and emotions and to keep these under control while we navigate a social situation. So when we can't or don't read the situation and adapt our behavior to it, those social aspects of life become more difficult, right? We can tolerate a temper tantrum from a 3-year-old. It's less likely that we'll tolerate that from a 21-year-old or a 30-year-old. We have to grow those skills of self-regulation. And some of that is innate, but we aren't just born with the ability to self-regulate. And if nobody teaches us how to do it, we don't gain those skills, and we do end up with adults who cope in unhealthy ways because nobody ever took the time to teach them how to regulate themselves. So they look to outside influences or outside substances to do that regulation for them. Tiffany talked about how smoking can do that for somebody who has a very active mind or has some anxiety. Smoking can help calm that. But so can self-regulation if we just teach people how to do that. And the classroom is a great way to do that. And I know we ask teachers to do so much with so little time. But self-regulation is something that really we can introduce in very small ways to help. And because there are so many strategies for practicing self-regulation. Things like belly breathing, mindfulness, dance, movement, prayer, and that can happen in a lot of different ways. One thing that I really like to do is a practice called ABC centering. It's very quick and easy. A is awareness. So, closing your eyes, sitting quietly, and you can do this at the start of a class. Ask your students to just take a minute to be aware of what their body is feeling. Do they have an increased heart rate? Pay attention to your breath rate. Are you taking deep breaths or shallow breaths? How are you feeling right now emotionally? Where are you at? Are you stressed about what's going on at home, or are you present in this classroom? So just take a minute to really sink into awareness of what's going on in your body right now. B is for balance. And that's really a physical balance. So shifting in your seat to a point where you feel really comfortable and supported and grounded in your seat where you are. And then C is for connection. And that can be a lot of things. It can be simply calling to mind an important relation, someone who makes you feel safe and secure and supported. Maybe for you right now, it's reaching out for that connection of what brought you here. Why are you here at this conference? Who are the people that you care about that drive you to continue your learning so that you can show up as the best instructor for your classroom? Call to mind those connections so that you can be centered in what is important to you. And that's it. And then you move on with your day. But you do so from a calm and centered place that's given you those 3 minutes to just really check in with your body. Be present here instead of in your mind, which may be far away from the classroom. Teaching people how to really breathe. What does belly breathing mean? Sometimes we have to spell that out for people. Breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. But very simple instructions that can go a long, long way in giving kids, especially, that fallback of what do I do when I start to feel my pulse race and my heartbeat increase and my breath become more shallow. I had a wonderful experience with my poor kids. They hear this all the time where I'm like, are you doing your belly breathing? Did you take some time to self-regulate? And my daughter plays softball, she's 13, and she had a really tough pitcher, she pitches a lot faster than they practiced. And so she was really nervous and she got a hit. And she came back to me after the game and said, Mom, I did that belly breathing thing where I was really nervous and I just took a couple of deep breaths and it worked. And I've been preaching this for months and months and months. And this was the first time that I got any feedback on it from my kids other than like eye rolls and like, yeah, whatever. So they are listening, and they'll, it gives them something to rely on when they start to feel a little bit chaotic. So what we see often when we don't have these things in place, when we don't have that self-regulation, when kids are dealing with adversity, it shows up as really this breakdown in the ability to process, integrate those experiences, and regulate that internal state. And that leads to a lot of difficulties, emotional regulation, comforting oneself, staying present, all of these, which then build into challenges to building that individual resilience. We see angry outbursts, daydreaming or spacing out, forgetfulness or spotty memory recall. changes in personality, social withdrawal, self-blame, chronic physical ailments, and school failure. All of this is what may present itself in the classroom because kiddos are dealing with adversity and they don't have the self-regulation skills to keep it in check. And when we dive deeper, we'll see more of these challenges with solving problems, seeing a way forward, and versus being really stuck in the emotion of it. Exercising judgment, taking initiative and making decisions and planning, and then that developing empathy, which I'm so glad to see that there was a session on that, and I'm excited that it was recorded so I can check that out, because empathy is huge. And again, I think it's a word we hear often, but we don't really unpack what does that mean? How do we teach empathy? Because again, it's not necessarily inherent to who we are. We have to sometimes teach these things. And certainly some aggression and impulsivity. So Tiffany talked about in the Corpus Callosum and that cohesion between the logical left brain and the emotional right brain, and how important that is in problem solving. And so in order to integrate those, we have to understand this river of integration, which is such a great visual. And we love to share this. It's the river of integration, excuse me, get so excited. The river of integration is this living of life as it unfolds, moment by moment, living in the moment. There will always be areas of life and situations where it's easier to live in the river, and other parts that will be more challenging and difficult, where you may move to the sides, where it may be more rigid or more chaos. And recognizing that when we are towards the banks and either being in that chaos or rigidity, that takes us out of the moment and it takes us out of connection. We aren't able to connect when we're trying to control. And when you're living with that rigidity, what you're doing is attempting to control things around you in order to feel safe. On the other side, chaos is kind of that throwing your hands up in the air and feeling like I have no control. Nothing I do matters. So things are unstable and unpredictable and unsafe. But when we get into the river of integration, we're much more able to be flexible, to take people as they come, to look towards solution building versus being stuck in the problem or stuck in the emotion. And so some key elements in really staying in the river are that centeredness, staying centered, being in the moment and recognizing that things will come and go, and being aware of them, and sometimes it's just letting it go, letting it move through. But then also having that self-awareness of your maybe unhealthy coping or any maladaptive tendencies that maybe they served you once, or for the children that you are teaching, maybe they served those kiddos in surviving a certain situation, but in the classroom they're not helping. So how do we help kids be aware of those? It's looking for patterns in yourself and in the kiddos that you're teaching, looking for those patterns of, okay, when stress comes up and you see them moving towards the banks of the river, what's the impetus? What's driving that? And then how can you maybe start to get in front of that and help give them the skills they need? When that thing comes up again, they're able to better cope. They're able to better stay in the river, stay aware and centered. There is a great acronym that Dr. Siegel identified with values that is coherence. And I'll put it in the chat box here because I know that it's really a lot. But it's coherence is connection, openness, harmony, engagement, receptivity, emergence, or being open to seeing things differently, noesis, or that intuitive knowledge that we all have, and sometimes we're taught to ignore, compassion and empathy. So these are really the values that keep us grounded in that river of integration. So think about how you can leave space for these in the classroom so that, again, we keep that environment of safety. So when we talk too about really managing our own stress, our own sort of vicarious trauma, dealing with maybe kids or teenagers who are dealing with their own traumas, and building up resilience, there are many different components, and we love this acronym of SERVE. And one very simple thing that you can do is share. So share that the behaviors are normal for stress. When you see these coping mechanisms, or maybe you are exhibiting them yourself, just talking through it and sharing that this is a normal thing, but really focusing on your strengths, and but really having that conversation that these are things that we all deal with at some point in time. And that also allows others to then share their own experience with you. Educate. Really what we're doing here today, sharing that message forward, educating about stress in the brain and the body. For those folks who are really stuck in that this is all a personal choice and a bad kid is a bad kid, or a bad kid is choosing to be disruptive, work to educate your community members, your coworkers who maybe haven't been exposed to this science, that stress affects our brains and bodies in very purposeful ways to keep us alive. Regulate, just like we talked about with self-regulation. Practice your own regulation of body and mind, and then help incorporate that practice for your community, your students, your coworkers. Make it really a part of your culture within your organization, that we take care of ourselves and we make time for self-regulation, whether in the classroom or the staff lounge. Validate anger and grief. So often we don't leave space for negative emotions. We want kids to quickly move into positivity. But those emotions are real and they're purposeful. We have to allow space for negative emotions too, and honor those emotions. We have to let them feel that sadness, that anger. Certainly we can help them understand appropriate ways to express it, but just shoving it down or ignoring it or moving too quickly through it is not helpful. And then lastly, E is for empower the self that lies beneath. Really recognizing that every person has something to contribute. Empowering oneself and your students to make decisions, to help them recognize their positive gifts and empower them to contribute to the community are all great ways to empower the self. The second protective system then that we can nurture is belonging. And many people talk about the importance of other people in their lives, those relationships, people who recognize and encourage our own unique talents and interests and strengths. You hear so often people tell stories of that one teacher in their educational career, right, who just saw them, who really saw their talents and helped them to see their own talents and really build that up, right? We all have the opportunity to be that person. Relationships with caring and competent people are vital contributors to resilience and recovery. Now, sometimes this message gets shortened and only includes caring relationships, but competency is equally important. Competency requires learning new skills and practicing safety in all of its forms. particularly when relating to people who are hardwired for survival in a dangerous and unpredictable world. Recognizing that people who have difficulty with emotional regulation, difficulty picking up social cues, problems with addiction or bonding, and other consequences of developmental trauma, those people can be challenging students, they can be challenging friends, difficult neighbors. And so if we haven't already done our own work, if we're not continually doing our own work to maintain our own self-regulation, to have a knowledge of where this behavior is coming from, if we don't have our own competency in these areas, caring about that person isn't enough, because caring about that person can get really difficult when they're really challenging. So we have to start with ourselves. And why I often will say that in terms of building resiliency, this is not about strategies as much as it is about building a culture of resiliency, a culture that allows for safety first. The hope is that relationships that provide security and belonging will become the norm as we all learn and improve our skills and competencies to be relevant and helpful during times of stress and challenge, as well as during celebration. Looking at how reinforcing loops work, right, where the dynamic is amplified with every turn, we can create a vicious or a virtuous reinforcing loop. So recognizing that, you know, ACEs happen, they're common, they often are co-occurring, and we know, science tells us that our bodies, our brains adapt to those ACEs in different ways. Therein then lies our window of opportunity to say, we're gonna look for a right fit engagement for kiddos and adults who have experienced ACEs and have adapted to those ACEs, versus our current societal response, which is sort of a just reject eject system, right? We kick them out of school, we as adults, we kick them out of society and put them in prisons and jails. But while they're there, or when we do that, when we eject, reject, we're not helping them build skills. We're not helping them contribute in meaningful ways. When we could choose to decide that every interaction matters and every person has a lived experience that is beneficial in some way. Every person has something to contribute. So we can choose to look for what that is versus just saying, you know, going back to that slide that Tiffany shared of social expectations colliding with adaptive behavior, right? We can choose to say, maybe you're not meeting my expectation of the classroom in this moment, but I'm going to work to find out how we can make a better fit for all of us versus just saying, you're out. We don't care about you here. You don't belong in this space. That is then what results in either flourishing or more adversity. And we know that further adversity is going to spread intergenerationally. So we can either interrupt that intergenerational transmission, or we can allow it to continue and know that those are going to be the next kiddos in our classroom. So finally, if we've decided to dramatically improve health and safety for this and future generations, we must foster thriving communities. And that right fit engagement plays right into it. Not only does that take into account our close belonging, but also that's what creates thriving communities, right? When we're looking for that right fit engagement in every aspect of community. Fostering thriving communities is really about empowerment, investing in the people who have the most at stake so that they can be the expert leaders of their own community's change. whether that's a geographic community or recognizing those individuals who are most affected by ACEs, recognizing that they have a lot to contribute because of their experience with ACEs. We have a lot to learn from them. And if we empower them to be part of the decision making, we all get the benefit of that knowledge and that experience. As we invest in that community capacity, we can systemically provide education like we're doing today about neurobiology, ACEs, and resilience. Again, so that local people, not just teachers, not just school systems, but employers and secondary education and university systems and churches, community chambers, so that all of us in a local area have a common language for this cross-sector and multidisciplinary work, because we can't continue to work in silos. It's not enough to just have a trauma-informed school and then send those kiddos back out to a community that is not safe, that does not empower them to be involved and make decisions. We have to all work together. Building community capacity is about helping people learn and manage and improve their efforts systematically. And that comes with, providing flexible funding, state-of-the-art education, direct support that helps mobilize everyone who wants to help, and having public and private partners that foster thriving communities often learn from those communities, and they celebrate exceptional results from their work when they look to what other communities are doing. Bringing it more individually here and talking about really how you can increase your own capacity, your own self-care and self-regulation, but also then thinking about how you can make space for this in your classroom and to give to your students as well. There are really 4 domains of resilience. And the goal is to not just exist in one domain, but to really have something in all those domains that you rely on, that you fall back on to build your resilience. Moving towards then that center gold piece, which is really balance and coherence. Again, recognizing that this is about practice and progress, not perfection, because none of us are perfect. I need this reminder constantly. I often will get stuck in sort of one mode of resilience building or regulation and feel like I'm doing okay. But it doesn't take long to realize that I'm out of balance then, and I need to work in all these areas. So that physical piece is, flexibility, strength, endurance. You're working with your body to have some movement. Nutrition is part of this as well, putting good things in your body to get good things out. Rest is also an important part of that physical resilience. In our society, we tend to really value busyness and overworking, but rest is imperative. Our body needs rest. We have to allow space for that. We have to say no sometimes. Mental is that ability to focus, incorporating multiple viewpoints. Emotional, again, that emotional flexibility, having a positive outlook, practicing self-regulation. If you're out of balance in these things, that may indicate where you need to focus your energy. Spiritual flexibility, a commitment to your values and a tolerance of others' values and beliefs is when you're balanced in that spiritual realm of resilience. We'll go quickly through some strategies in each of these areas. When we talk about strategies for physical resilience, again, we've talked about nutrition and exercise. That's those breathing exercises. So it's often referred to as box breathing, where you are really being conscious of, taking a breath in for a count of 4, holding it for a count of 4, letting it out for a count of 4, holding it for a count of 4, and continue. New hobbies, things like gardening is great for physical resilience, really getting into the dirt, and again, that rest piece, taking your breaks during the day, giving yourself a minute to just be still and be silent. When we move into mental strategies, specifically for immediate grounding, when you're feeling yourself really unable to focus, unable to kind of pull it back in, thoughts all over the place, some great things that you can do for immediate grounding, and this is great for students, is just describing your environment in detail, focusing on the details and describing it out loud. Naming certain objects around you with colors and sounds and textures. Picturing in your mind's eye a safe place. And again, focusing and describing the details of that visual. And if all else fails, this one is really great to just read a sentence or repeat the alphabet really, really slowly, or with the alphabet doing it backwards. The crux here for all of these things is really that you're refocusing the mind on something that you have to really think about. So if I'm really focused on the details of my environment, that requires my focus. And once I pull that focus in, it's easier to then move on to what I was trying to focus on initially. When we talk about emotional strategies, then for immediate grounding, for the emotional stuff, music is great for that. Whether it's listening to a song or just bringing to mind a song that has those real feel-good memories. Music is so key to so many memories in people's lives and so strongly tied to memory. But emotionally, you can just call to mind a person. So that's that C, that connection piece in the ABC centering. Calling to mind somebody who gives you that feel-good feeling, that safety feeling, is great for emotional grounding. Even writing yourself notes, positive notes that you can then look back on in a time of stress or feeling sort of emotionally chaotic. Long-term, then, to build up those protective factors, self-awareness is key. Really being aware of what's normal for you, and then being able to key into when that's different, when things are off. Recognizing your strengths and your weaknesses in these areas, and not being judgmental of them, but just being aware of them. Help, asking for help. Who's in your circle? Who can you reach out to when you're stressed? And then really being mindful of, are those people lifting you up or are they tearing you down? Do you feel better after you reach out to that person, or do you kind of walk away feeling worse? Know who you can count on and who builds you up, and then really strengthen those relationships. Keeping balance between home and work. When we have that balance, it's easier for us to stay in the moment where we are. So to be home when you're home, and to be in the classroom or at work when you're at work. Also know, who you can talk to in those environments. Having an at-home person or a outside of work person to rely on, and then having a coworker or somebody at work who really gets the day-to-day and can really understand that maybe those challenges that you're going through. Always staying open to new learning and growing is so key, which obviously you're all here, so you've got that. And then expression of feelings and mindfulness, giving yourself time and really putting into practice a time to build that self-awareness through mindfulness of where you're at and what you're feeling. Using journaling or music or sharing to really work through and express your feelings. The spiritual piece, then, I want to be very clear that this is self-defined. There is not one definition of spirituality. It may be religious for you, it may not be. I was camping this week, and to sit on a bench with my feet in the grass and to look out over the lake and to feel the wind on my face, that was probably a more spiritual experience for me, a reminder of how connected I am to the earth and to other people than anything else. Now, for some people, that may be walking through a wooded area. It may be worshiping with your friends and neighbors at church. It may be prayer or fasting silently and alone. But really, it's whatever brings you back to a sense of it's bigger than just you. You are connected to everyone and everything around you, and you're not alone. That's really the spiritual piece. And certainly there's cultural care in there, which may help some of you define that, what that looks like for you, but really honoring that and paying attention to it. So finally, I would encourage you all to take the time to really create a self-care safety plan. And again, think about how you can spread this forward to your classroom. Does it make sense to incorporate this into your classroom in some way? If you have students who are more disruptive or maybe haven't had these lessons, how can you implement this and really weave this into the culture of your school, of your workplace, of your organization, so that not only do you have an individual safety care plan, self-care safety plan, excuse me, but also so that you're helping others around you develop their own. And again, we'll share this, these slides, so you don't have to try to, furiously write all this down. But I do encourage you to really take the time to sit with this for a while and do the work to think about how do you cope right now? What's working, what isn't, where can you improve? Who can you rely on? And really be intentional about building this. And we are right at the end of our time. I would encourage you to use that chat box if you have any questions. We would very much appreciate your feedback. So we'll send out a link to the survey to just, let us know what's helpful, what's not, what you'd like more of, what wasn't clear, if anything wasn't clear. But really, your honest feedback is so helpful in us continuing to improve how we provide this information. And with that, I want to once again thank you for spending your morning with us. And we've got our contact information there. If you have any questions or needs, let us know.